about birth and the basics of birth and the physiology of birth, as well as sort of our healthcare system's approach to care for pregnant, birthing, and postpartum people. So as you know, I was a home birth midwife for a long time. Also worked in birth centers. For most of my, the time I was practicing clinically, I worked with families and communities that were historically and currently oppressed, um, and did a lot of home births, particularly for people who needed to avoid the healthcare system. That the healthcare system was actively harmful for folks, and so home birth was an alternative. Um, and then I had this, maybe year and a half of doing births for very wealthy people in mansions. When I moved back to Massachusetts, I did not enjoy it. So I do other stuff now. So that being said, I'm not here to convert anyone to home birth or talk about, the right way for you or your partner or your friend or your family to give birth. There is no right way for everyone. Um, the other disclaimer is talking about gender and gendered language. So, birth has traditionally been talked about in very, very gendered ways and kind of set up as a women's issue as opposed to a people's issue or a human issue. Um, and I think that that's really a problem, that's sort of been our narrative around birth for a long time, because we know that not everyone who gives birth is a woman. Plenty of people who are not women, people of many different genders, give birth, become pregnant, and give birth, and make reproductive choices of all different kinds. And so yeah, so it's really important to acknowledge that when we talk about people giving birth, we're not just talking about women. But at the same time, the way we do care for childbearing, so that includes prenatal care, care during birth, and care after birth, or in what's called the postpartum period, the period after giving birth. So the way we do care for childbearing, particularly in the US, is very much connected to patriarchy. It's very much rooted in patriarchy and misogyny, which, as we know, are rooted in white supremacy and ableism. So when we talk about the way systems of oppression interact with birth, it's really important to acknowledge the ways that birth has been gendered, and that if the majority of people giving birth were men, for example, I think our healthcare system, our system for caring for childbearing would look really, really different. Um, but again, I don't want the fact that we're talking about patriarchy and misogyny in the healthcare system to be taken as we are as all people who give birth are women. That's just not true. It never has been. So as you can tell, this was originally a presentation for public health folks. So I am skipping over some public health stuff, but I do want to talk a little bit about the biology and physiology of birth, if people are curious about that. Um, so birth happens when I talk about birth, I'm really talking about labor. So this is, at the end of a person's pregnancy, the process of giving birth, and we divide it into four stages. In my practical experience, it's not quite as linear as all of this, but things can overlap a little. But what we think of is the first stage of labor, which is further divided into a few phases that I'll talk about in a sec. But the first stage of labor is kind of what we usually see on TV when someone's in labor, right? They have contractions which cause their cervix or the opening of their uterus to get bigger or dilate, um, as well as causing the fetus to kind of move downwards. And that can be a process for a stage of labor. It can last anywhere from a few hours to 24 hours or more. It's definitely the longest part of labor. Um, Second stage is the pushing stage. So at that point, the cervix or opening to the uterus has dilated or opened all the way. kind of disappeared actually. So there's an opening now for the fetal skull and the rest of the fetus to come out of. And that involves, um, really it's like a athletic feat of pushing out the baby through the cervix or opening in the uterus. Um, and second stage ends when the baby is born. Um, Third stage is from when the baby is born to the placenta being born. The placenta usually comes out, a few to 10 or 15 minutes after the birth of the baby. Sometimes it can take as long as 1 to 2 hours for the placenta to be born. The fourth stage of labor is the first few hours postpartum. Um, just because there are so many changes happening to both the baby's body, the baby's breathing outside the uterus for the very first time, is exposed to air for the very first time. So there's a lot of physiological changes happening for the newborn. There's also a whole lot of changes happening physically just in those first hours for the new parent, the person who's just given birth, as their body goes from being pregnant to not being pregnant. So, and during those first few hours, it's often a time that people will bond with their baby, though. I mean, we have our entire lives to bond with our families. So it's not, I think sometimes we talk about fourth stage as like this now or never time. That's not true. And if a person's planning on breastfeeding or chest feeding, that often gets established in the first few hours too, because newborns have instincts that sort of drive them to look for a food source in the first few hours, whether that's breastfeeding or something else. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about about the stages of labor. So first stage, as I mentioned, is divided into a few different phases. So early labor and centimeters of dilation is just kind of basically if you were to examine a laboring person's cervix or that, again, that opening to the uterus and measure it. In real life, centimeters of dilation is kind of a bullshit thing, and it's better to, keep your hands out of a person's body as a general rule. And there's other ways of sort of assessing what part of labor they're in as well. So early labor though is considered the beginning part of labor, the first couple centimeters of dilation. People will have contractions every 5 minutes to every half hour, and contractions tend not to have a pattern. So contractions are the uterine muscles becoming really tight. And it feels sort of like, that thing where you get a Charlie horse in your leg and like your calf muscle tenses and just kind of like stays tense for a minute or so and then relaxes and it hurts because it's muscle tightening and it's painful. It's like that. Although at first it can feel sort of like menstrual cramps as well, or just kind of sensations. And for a lot of people, though, this early labor is kind of the hardest part of labor because it feels like it's going on forever without much changing, without being any closer to birth. And it's distracting and it's hard to kind of go about your day. And also, a lot of people have what's called practice labor or practice contractions or Braxton Hicks contractions after the two dudes, Braxton and Hicks, the two cis men who discovered them. So I often just say practice contractions, which are contractions that don't result in birth. But that's something kind of in hindsight, not as it's happening. So people wonder, like, is this even real, or am I just kind of going through this without even being in labor or having a baby. So as much as people can like nap or eat or just go about their life as much as they can in early labor, it's a good thing. It can be challenging too. Active labor is once labor kind of gets going. So it's no longer early. Contractions become more regular, regularly timed. They become closer together. They last longer. And then transition is kind of the last couple centimeters of dilation. Um, and it's generally the quickest part of labor, but it can be a really intense part of labor. People feel really, it's a lot of physical work. People start feeling like, I just can't do this. And as a midwife, I would always love it when I heard a laboring person say, I can't do it anymore. Not because I like enjoy people suffering, but because it's kind of a sign that, like, well, you won't have to do it for much longer, it seems like. Um, and in transition, people tend to be really kind of inside themselves, and also sometimes feel really just like out of control because your body is doing stuff. Your body is doing intense stuff that you're not choosing. So it can be an emotional time as well. And then something that rarely kind of gets shown because I think it doesn't make for good TV content, among other reasons. Um, and because it's not, it hasn't really been fully documented by the medical model, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. There's this thing that happens called a lull, where someone, goes through transition, their cervix has opened up all the way, and contractions kind of slow down, and they feel tired. And I've seen people kind of take naps between transition when they're feeling like, oh, this is so intense, I can't do it, and when they start pushing their baby out. So yeah, that lull is important. Um, in the first stage of labor, it's important to, this is kind of a time of watchful waiting in the midwifery model. So we're kind of looking to see what people's bodies are doing, and helping them be comfortable. And oftentimes, almost all the times actually, um, careful watching and monitoring in first stage, the labor part of birth, really helps us predict complications. So if something, and helps us kind of prevent complications too. If something is happening in early labor that looks like it might be a warning sign, that allows us to act. And, if it's a home birth, go to the hospital where a person might need, more advanced care than we can provide at home. They might need a cesarean or C-section, sometimes also called surgical birth. And we're able to predict that by what's happening in their early parts of labor before pushing starts. It's also a time when like being comfortable is really important. So being up and active can help move labor along, but it can also help people be more comfortable. Lying down flat on your back for many people is really uncomfortable in labor. It's some of the least comfortable way to be. I know for myself when I was in labor, different positions were really helpful. So like leaning against a wall was really comfortable. Laying down on my back was not, and that's a pretty common experience. And it helped also, different positions and being upright can help move labor along because of gravity. If you think about, a person standing up and a fetus inside that person, one of the things that makes the cervix dilate is the fetal head pressing down on it. And so gravity sort of maximizes that. Again, if you're not doing anything wrong, if you ever happen to be in labor and feel most comfortable lying on your back, like more power to you. And this is also a time when, like, having your favorite music on helps, having the people you want around you who are supportive, and people who aren't supportive not there is helpful. It can be really comfortable to take a shower, to take a bath, to, I walked around with a heating pad on my lower back for like one of those ones you like tie on for, so many hours. Um, so yeah, and people's bodies tend to know what they're doing. People will do the things that are comfortable to them, and it'll turn out that, oh, okay, this person who wanted to spend their entire labor standing on one leg, actually the baby was a little bit, was sort of like positioned to one side, and so standing on one leg actually really helped the fetus shift positions into a better position for a birth. So yeah, people kind of, our bodies are get kind of intuitive, I think, about labor. And then, so second stage, like I said, is the pushing stage that starts with full dilation. and ends with the birth of the baby. And again, positioning can be really helpful. And yeah, help the baby to be born. Third stage is the birth of the placenta, which is usually 10 to 15 minutes after the baby. I nerd out about how cool the placenta is. You don't have to join me in this, um, but you can. Yeah, I mean, I really nerd out about how cool the placenta is. So the placenta, as you can see in the diagram, it's about the size of like a dinner plate. I hope I didn't ruin dinner. Um, and it's about an inch or two thick. And it's cool because, among other reasons, so the birth of the placenta prevents hemorrhage. So basically, after the baby is born, the placenta, which has been attached to the wall of the uterus, separates. Um, and then when the placenta is born, because there's less room inside the uterus now, once the placenta has been birthed, the uterus is able to clamp down and sort of those open wound almost where the placenta was. Those blood vessels are able to, as the uterus um, folds in a little, those open blood vessels and tissue kind of pile on top of each other, and form what's called a living ligature. So they almost act like sutures. If you've ever had to get stitches in a cut and they sew it up by kind of joining tissue together, which stops bleeding. So as the uterus contracts down, back to the not back to the size it was pre-pregnancy, but it contracts down somewhat after the placenta is born, and it almost acts like if you got stitches holding the tissue together, which stops bleeding. Um, and breastfeeding or chest feeding can be helpful to this process because it releases a hormone called oxytocin, that we'll be talking about in just a minute, and that hormone helps the uterus clamp down over where the placenta was. I am trying very hard to hold back on telling you a bunch of placenta stories. I will hold back on that. I think so. Yes. Okay, I can do it. But seriously, ask me. So, fourth stage, again, like I said, is the first few hours after birth. Um, Babies in general are born very sort of like hardwired to bond. So they do a lot of looking around in their first couple hours, and then they take a nap, and then they wake up and they're ready to bond again. And so, I mean, like I said, that's sort of the myth of like if you don't bond with your kid in the first couple hours, you never will, is just total bullshit. Like this is sort of what people do their entire lives. Um, and so, what's happening kind of physically for the birthing person in the fourth stage is that process I talked about of the uterus getting smaller. Um, that's called uterine involution. Involution is just Latin for getting smaller, apparently. And so that's happening, and that takes a full like 6 weeks for the uterus to return to the size that it was before pregnancy. So the uterus goes from being sort of the size of like a large strawberry, small. That's a really large strawberry, actually. I take that back. Think like the size of like a clementine pre-pregnancy to being the largest muscle in the human body. The term uterus is the largest muscle in the human body. And then in the 6 weeks after giving birth, it goes back to being, clementine to orange sized. Strawberries. It's some cloudy with a chance of meatball shit, if anyone's ever read that children's book. Um, okay. So the other thing that's really important to talk about is the hormonal mechanisms of labor. And sort of what's going on hormonally, because this has important implications for how we handle labor, kind of as a system, as a healthcare system, rather, and how we care for people in labor and birthing people. So the hormonal mechanism of labor is controlled by two or there's two really important hormones here. The first one is oxytocin, which is sometimes described as the love hormone. It's a bonding hormone. So we release oxytocin when we're looking deeply into someone's eyes. Also, they did a study, and both people and dogs release oxytocin when they look in each other's eyes. So you get the same kind of oxytocin rush looking at your dog as you do looking at a person, and your dog feels the same way, which is particularly interesting because with other animals and with with each other, like if two dogs are looking each other in the eye, it's an aggression thing. It's seen as a sign, as like initiating a fight. And dogs' hormones react like you're initiating a fight if you're another dog looking them in the eye. But if you're a person looking in a dog's eyes, they release oxytocin and bond with you, and I think that's so cool. Um, Oxytocin, right? Love hormone. Um, Oxytocin's also released during sex and orgasm. It's very much sort of the I feel safe right now hormone. Oxytocin production increases when we feel safe. So whatever it is that causes a person to feel safe and therefore release oxytocin also causes labor to progress. So the more oxytocin in the laboring person's body, the more their labor is moving on, and progressing, and getting to the part where the kid's born and they move on with their lives as a parent. So that's also really important to kind of think about what feels safe to one person might not feel safe to another person. So for you, having your mom in the room might increase your oxytocin levels because you might feel really safe having your parent there. For me, if my mother walks in the room, my oxytocin does the opposite of spiking. It bottoms out because I do not feel safe around my mother. So, and again, for some people, having a lot of people in the room, having your friends, your family there with you, makes you feel safer and causes your oxytocin levels to go up. For some people, it's the opposite. Having people around you makes you feel less safe, or makes you feel less, like you have to be entertaining them, or looking out for them, and so your oxytocin levels go down. This varies so much person to person. We're all different. But so whatever it is that makes a person's oxytocin increase, labor progresses when people's oxytocin is high and they feel in control. Um, the other hormone that's really important to labor is adrenaline, the fear hormone. So this was a great adaptation, back in cave person days. Um, if you were in your cave and a saber-toothed tiger came to attack you, you would need to not just continue to be in labor, you'd have to get up and run away from the saber-toothed tiger. Um, so so it was a good adaptation back in, when we had to worry about apex predators coming to eat us. Now that we've become the apex predator of all life on Earth, and we don't need to worry as much about saber-toothed tigers, this is something to think about in the design of our healthcare system. Um, our bodies, our laboring bodies, are built in such a way that when we feel afraid, labor shuts down. Our labor doesn't progress if we're afraid. So some quick facts about labor. Again, labor can last a while. It can be really quick. It's generally not. I've been to births that have been 3 days long. I've been to births where like I come running in. I had a birth once where I got called into the birth center, which was like 4 blocks from my home. It was the middle of the night. My client was there. I was like, "Yeah, let me get dressed for this birth. Let me like put on underwear and pants and then something." And the person who had called me in was like, hey Nahama, like you do not have time to put on underwear and pants, like just come on down. And I got there just as the baby was like I, drove down the 4 blocks as fast as I can, like left my keys in the ignition and just got there like barely. I mean, the baby was already like the head was already being born, which is called crowning when you can see the top of the head. The baby was already crowning, and if I had stopped to like put on real pants instead of the sweatpants I was wearing, or if I'd put on a bra or underpants with my pajamas, I would have missed the birth. So it can be really fast. Can also take a long time. Um, Only about 5% of babies are born on their due date. In general, if you don't break the bag of waters or the amniotic sac, it's not like in the movies where someone's water breaks in the grocery store and then their kid's born in the produce aisle or whatever. It's much more, that can happen, but it's much more common for the bag of waters or the amniotic sac to break while the person's in labor, like kind of towards the end of labor. And the thing to think about too is that, so I was talking about a 30-day labor. So with that, it's contractions that last, kind of at their longest 2 minutes. And then when they're at their most close together, um, having, a 2 or 3 or 5 minute break, and often like a longer break in between contractions. So it's not like having a Charlie horse or a broken leg for 3 days. It's having a painful contraction that ends and a break, and a painful contraction that ends and a break. Um, and people have been doing this for a damn long time. It's painful and it's something we can do. Um, yeah, it hurts and we can do painful things. And I think in particular, so I know I'd kind of given that disclaimer about gendered language. And on this slide, I consciously chose to say women can do it. That's not to say that people in labor who are other genders can't do it. They can. People of all genders can and do and always have do this painful thing and give birth. Um, whether that's vaginally or by cesarean or some other way, which maybe hasn't been discovered yet. But people do it. And yeah, but I really wanted to kind of call attention to the way we talk about labor and sort of the assumption that this is too hard for people doing it. I think is really tied to the fact that a lot of people doing it are women. And we have this really patriarchal healthcare system that wants to that's sort of built on the premise that people gendered as women, and anyone not gendered as a cis man can't do things, and needs to be managed. And so I really want to call that out and say that, no, that's not true. People who aren't cis men can and do stuff. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to, in a second here, make another video about sort of how we manage labor in the United States healthcare system. But I wanted to give you first the basics of, what labor is and how it works.